Hi everybody. I think we are ready to get started. I want to welcome you all here on this Tuesday afternoon. In the Northeast, it's very cold, but you may be somewhere else. There's a lot of news right now on international and domestic affairs. And what happened on January 3rd in Venezuela is continuing to have very serious effects on the people of Venezuela. And it's also going to have long-term effects on the domestic politics in the United States. And we wanted to bring together people from the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst to talk about some of the issues. My name is Jamie Rowan. I'm a professor of legal studies and the director of the Center for Justice, Law, and Societies. With us today, we have Professor Charlie Carpenter from the Department of Political Science, Associate Professor Angelica Bernal from the Department of Political Science as well, and Martha Fuentes Bautista from the Department of Communications here at UMass. I'm going to get started just to talk a little bit about the domestic legal context for what just happened and really just set the stage as to what happened and why and how, according to domestic U.S. law, before turning it over to my colleague, Professor Carpenter, to talk about the international legal implications. After that, we'll hear from Professor Bernal, who will discuss regional issues related to the incursion and extractivism. And then we'll turn it over to Professor Fuentes Bautista, who has a much stronger pulse on what is going on the ground in Venezuela, where the people who are going to suffer the most from this live. And so that is the event. What I would really ask of all of you who are here watching is to use the Q&A. After I give quick remarks, we will be answering questions that we can if you put them into the Q&A. And then at the end of our remarks, which will be brief, we will then turn it over to you all and I will moderate and ask some questions that emerge from the Q&A so that we can have a conversation and then maybe ask each other some questions. Before I begin, I see that our dean is here. I don't know if Dean Rethemeyer, you want to say a few words about SBS before I kick it off?
So, first of all, welcome. We are really pleased to see so many people who are interested in this event. I apologize for being late, being in an earlier meeting. This is an important part of a series of conversations that we started all the way before the election of 2024 that considers a wide range of matters around democracy, the place of the United States in the world, how we are reconceptualizing that, and how we have to think about the ways that the policy choices that we're making now are not only important to the immediate future, but the long-term conceptualization of who we are as a country, what our role in this region and other regions of the world will be, and how we as researchers, scholars, alums, and students here at SBS can make a contribution to helping all of us understand what's happening and the ramifications that come from the choices that are being made, and how we have to think about that in the context of many of the things that we care about, from justice to democracy to the way that technology affects all aspects of decision making these days, and the way that some of us live in different political realities that may be harder for all of us to understand and to pierce, and that can influence the way that we think about the same events and the same facts, but see them in very different lights. So I'm really proud that this will be one of a number of events that we're holding this year that will help everyone think more creatively about the things that are happening in our times.
Thank you. So I'm just going to get started to talk a little bit about what happened. So on January 3rd, in the middle of the morning hours, the United States launched a military operation into Venezuela to abduct and arrest Nicolás Maduro, who's the sitting head of state in Venezuela, although not recognized as such by the United States. So the question that may arise for many people is, what is the legal authority that the U.S. has to enter a foreign country and arrest a sitting head of state. Again, one that we don't recognize, but that is recognized in his own country as such. Professor Carpenter will talk about the international law, but domestically, what this was an arrest warrant that was issued by the Department of Justice in 2020. And when the Department of Justice issues an arrest warrant, if it's in the United States, there is a police force, there are federal marshals that can deliver that arrest warrant and forcibly bring somebody into U.S. custody. This does not happen in foreign territories, except in a couple of circumstances that I want to talk about. But the excuse of the Trump administration to enter Venezuela is that there was a valid arrest warrant and that the United States has the authority to use force to execute it. There actually is a case from 1890 that says that this is true. And these are really interesting cases to look back on, to think through how did it emerge that the United States claims it can use force to effectuate an arrest warrant. And that was a case in California where there was a federal marshal who killed someone who was attacking a judge. And that federal marshal was at first found to be guilty of murder, but the Supreme Court said he's not. He used force to protect an executive branch officer. And so, therefore, or as an executive, as part of the executive, he was helping effectuate an arrest warrant and helping the courts. And so he is not going to be guilty of murder. The executive can use force to support the judicial functions. And so that is the sort of domestic context. And then we go into a foreign country and do it. And again, we have really interesting case law that says that's okay. There's a case out of Mexico where a man who was accused of helping murder a DEA agent, the Drug Enforcement Agency, Mexico refused to extradite him. And without $50,000 from the United States. And so the DEA secretly paid $50,000 to 5 bounty hunters in Mexico to drug him, arrest him, and fly him to the United States. He, of course, contested that and said that he was abducted and therefore he shouldn't be tried. And the Supreme Court actually said it doesn't matter, actually, that you were abducted. You are being accused of a crime that we have jurisdiction over. And so we are going to prosecute you. Interestingly, he won that case. He was found not guilty. He came back and tried to sue the government. And the Supreme Court said you actually aren't entitled to any remedy because being forcibly abducted for a day doesn't entitle you to a remedy. So that is a case from the early 90s. And so we have really recent case law that says it's okay to illegally bring someone to the United States as long as if they're in court and that a warrant for their arrest is valid and they're being tried in a valid way. Now, the other thing that is going to come into play with the Maduro case is whether he is a head of state and he has head of state immunity and whether he can claim prisoner of war status. These are two things that Manuel Noriega claimed and that he had some we have some interesting case law from that. So the 1989 invasion of Panama is really the precedent here. And the case law that came out of that is very detailed and very interesting in explaining how the United States could have jurisdiction over someone who claims he's a prisoner of war. That case said even if he's a prisoner of war, even if there is a conflict, the United States can prosecute for crimes that we have jurisdiction over, in this case, narco trafficking. So claiming that Maduro is the head of a drug trafficking or has profited from drug trafficking. We have jurisdiction over that. And so the Noriega precedent said we can prosecute. Noriega was found guilty. And interestingly, in his sentencing, the judge in that case said that he is entitled to prisoner of war status. What's interesting about that is it didn't change the sentence. It did change where he was kept after he was found guilty. So he was kept in a quite nice facility until he was extradited to France and then later to Panama, where he died. But these are the sort of legal frameworks. And the thing that I think we should consider, especially in light of the story of the Mexican national who was abducted and brought to the U.S., is that in domestic law enforcement, the way we discourage unlawful behavior is we don't allow the evidence that the police collect unlawfully to enter the courtroom and be used against the defendant. That is used to deter unlawful behavior by the police. Well, in this setting, in the case law we have, the courts have not created a similar deterrent to engaging in unlawful activity to bring a defendant to the United States. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Carpenter.
Thank you, Jamie. So I am going to talk about the question of whether the mission that captured the Maduros was a violation of international law. And the answer to that question is, it depends. Are we talking about the international law on initiating armed force or the law on conducting armed force? And if we mean the latter, then which laws? Because if this wasn't a war, an armed attack, as Trump claims, then the laws of war don't really apply, but a whole different set of international standards does. So I'll walk you through what these different bodies of international law say in turn. So first, let's talk about the law on starting a war. That would be the UN Charter. Just about everybody agrees that under the UN Charter, if this was an armed attack, it was an illegal one. And that is because the bedrock rule in the UN Charter is the prohibition of armed force by one state against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state, except under two conditions. And the first is self-defense against an armed attack by that other state, or two, authorization by the UN Security Council. Neither of these conditions holds here. There is no evidence whatsoever that Venezuela attacked the US first, and the US did not even seek Security Council authorization, much less receive it, before we went in. And that is because this was not just a unilateral armed intervention, but one, as Professor Rowan points out, designed to arrest a sitting head of state who, for as long as he was in power, enjoyed sovereign immunity from prosecution by other states. So this norm of sovereign immunity is the foundation on which all international diplomacy rests. The only exception is warrants from the International Criminal Court, so not another state, but an international court. And for all these reasons, there is largely a consensus that under UN Charter rules, the invasion itself was illegal. Now, that didn't necessarily have to be true. We can imagine a world in which the US went to the Security Council and successfully made the case that leaving Maduro in power would constitute a threat to international peace and security. And there was a pathway by which he could have been arrested in a lawful manner that would not have violated sovereign immunity. If you ask me in Q&A, I can tell you what those options might have looked like. But that's not what happened. And even in a universe where a raid and snatch mission of a sitting head of state like this would be legal, there would then also be rules on how to use force to that objective. And those are laid out in the Geneva Convention. So that's a separate question. Would this attack have met international legal standards for the conduct of armed conflict, civilian harm mitigation, military necessity, proportionality, etc., even if it had been approved by the Security Council? Now, and that's the Geneva Convention we're talking about now, not the UN Charter. So a skilled defense JAG attorney could argue, it did meet that standard. There's only a few confirmed civilian deaths so far. None of them are clearly intentional. And the majority of the casualties were members of the security forces. And the Maduros were captured, not killed, and were being detained in accordance, arguably, with international standards for detention. But then there was also the intentional and indiscriminate downing of the electric grid, which would have affected the whole city. There's also loss of civilian property and injuries as well as deaths. So lawyers could view this both ways under the Geneva Conventions and would probably argue it both ways in court, because in legal terms, these more murky indirect harms are concerning, but they're not as clearly prohibited under the Geneva Conventions as massacring civilians or shooting surrendering troops in cold blood, things like that. However, using the Geneva Conventions as a standard assumed that this would be viewed as an armed attack in which the laws of armed conflict would apply. But the Trump administration says it was not. This was just a law enforcement operation. So let's suspend disbelief for a moment. After all, most law enforcement operations do not involve military assets or scores of dead military personnel on the other side. But let's say this were a law enforcement operation. Would the means used have been considered proportionate as they might be in a situation of war? And my answer is absolutely not. That is because the standard for law enforcement missions is not the laws of war standard, but rather human rights law standard. And police are held to far higher standards for discriminate, proportional, non-lethal violence in peacetime than the armed forces are in time of war. And this is reflected in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the U.S. is a signatory. It's also reflected in the International Police Organization Constitution. And of course, in U.S. domestic laws, Department of Justice rules prohibit the use of lethal force while apprehending suspects, except in very limited circumstances, usually only when directed at a violent suspect themselves in a way that avoids harm to innocent bystanders. So a now familiar to all of you, I imagine, example, the Department of Justice explicitly prohibits shooting motorists operating moving vehicles. Why? Because a dead motorist behind the wheel leaves a vehicle out of control, potentially harming civilian bystanders. So how well does the Venezuela raid fare under that higher law enforcement bar for avoiding collateral damage that Trump inadvertently accepted in a way when he characterized the raid in this way? Well, one does not use explosive weapons in police operations because in urban environments, those are inherently indiscriminate. Maybe only 4 to 10 civilians died, but 2 whole residential buildings collapsed as a result of the raid. And that is something no police officer could or would justify if it happened in a US or French or Canadian or Norwegian city. And no law enforcement officer in any civilized country would intentionally cause an electrical blackout of an entire city, even for a short period, in order to capture a single criminal suspect. So some civilians rely on electricity for their very lives, babies in incubators, elderly persons on oxygen. Blackouts also interrupt the work of first responders or doctors. They wreak havoc with industrial equipment, air traffic controllers. This all puts workers and travelers at risk. So all of this would dramatically outweigh the tactical advantage in arresting a single suspect. It just wouldn't really be considered in a normal police operation. So the bottom line is, this raid countervened international legal standards really whichever way you look at it, whether as a war or as a law enforcement operation. If this was an armed attack, even if the Geneva Conventions were more or less followed, it would still be illegal under the UN Charter to have gone in at all in the way we did. And if it wasn't an armed attack, but just a law enforcement operation, then the Geneva Conventions don't matter, but human rights law does. And the lives lost, property destroyed, and instability unleashed could then be argued to be wholly disproportionate to the aim of capturing a single criminal suspect for trial, even if there was an indictment against him. So that's where I'll stop for now, but I'm happy to answer further questions or embellish on these remarks in Q&A.
So first, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And in the time that I have, I want to briefly unpack something that you've been hearing quite a lot, which that this is all about the oil. Now, the U.S. attacked Venezuela on January 3rd, but we know now that oil executives were briefed before anyone about the U.S.'s plans to assume control of all of Venezuela's oil. More than any sector, Trump has met continually with oil execs from at least 17 companies, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Valero, Marathon, Shell, the list goes on. And Trump is currently asking for investments in oil industry spending of at least $100 billion. So to unpack that, it's all about the oil. I want to outline what's at stake in 3 ways. First, what's at stake for extractive industries and for Trump. Second, for Venezuela and the region. And third, for the world with regards to our global climate crisis and a just energy transition. So let me start with the first one, the extractive perspective. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, accounting for about 17% of the market share above Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Canada. In 2025 alone, it produced about 303 billion barrels. By comparison, the US ranks 8th in the world with 83 billion barrels. For all the talk of green energy, oil remains today the most lucrative industry and the most lucrative mode of investments. For the US, Venezuela has always been a problem, not only because it's holding oil reserves so close, but also because it's refused to sell them to the US, especially after Obama's 2015 sanctions when the government declared Venezuela originally a security threat. Now, instead of the US, China has been the powerhouse as a primary trading partner and investor for not only Venezuela, but the whole region. And since Maduro's arrest, the only oil tankers that have left Venezuela and are allowed are US-bound ones, thus cutting off China. So this also answers the second question in part about what it means for the region. The action on Venezuela is hugely impactful in cutting off other Latin American countries relying on Venezuela, but cutting off also importantly Chinese power in the region. The US, through violence and impinging on Venezuelan sovereignty, is aggressively asserting US hemispheric monopoly over oil. As recent actions also to invade Greenland also show, and we should note that Greenland is mineral rich. It also, all of this is showing that there's a larger scheme at stake to assert not only US oil interests, but moreover, a global dominance over extractive industries altogether, not just oil. But when we talk about extractive industries, what we're talking about is mineral extraction and others that are in high demand, such as microchips, batteries, and so-called green technologies like solar panels. And this could not come at a worse time. For now nearly 2 decades, climate scientists, environmentalists, and indigenous activists have sounded the alarm that we're facing a planetary crisis resulting directly from fossil fuel industries. And the recommendation in various climate conferences and accords has been to not just cut off carbon emissions, but aggressively stop reliance on fossil fuels. This is familiar terrain that everybody's heard. But what is unfamiliar to most people is that Latin America has actually been a leader more than the US, even while they have been facing governments that have aggressively sought to open up new extractive frontiers. I want to name a couple of few innovations. For instance, in Ecuador and Bolivia, you've had groundbreaking constitutional protections, such as the Declaration of the Rights of Nature. You've also had national referenda and moratoriums on oil drilling in biodiverse areas in various countries. You've also had successful legal cases to hold extractive companies on the basis of free, prior, and informed consent norms. And just recently, Colombia declared areas like the Amazon zones free from extractions. Now, movements in the regions which we've termed anti-extractive because they've said no to oil extraction or any extraction altogether have made important inroads. And the US's attack on Venezuela is going to have a chilling effect on the gains as well as threatened environmental activists in the region. And also there are all of our ability to learn as people that care about this climate catastrophe and to develop urgently needed effective measures to curb this crisis globally. Now, let me end also specifically with these, what it means with regards to Venezuela. Oil production is a horrifying industry in terms of environmental damages. The oil in Venezuela is considered one of the dirtiest in variety, containing sulfur, which sulfur produces the highest amount of greenhouse gases. The oil infrastructure in Venezuela, which long preceded Chavez and Maduro, is also notoriously bad, leaving constant oil spills. And the transport of oil across the ocean inevitably leads also to spills. The US's takeover of Venezuela's oil industry, along with being an obscene and illegal disregard for sovereignty, is also going to make things way worse. Industry practice is not to fix pipes that fail, but also to decommission, so-called to decommission them, which is to just leave them to continue to rot, which they consider to be more cost-effective. And they will just continue to build new ones, setting new cycles of damage into motion. Also, this is going to fuel further corruption as there's a transfer already of funds to private Venezuelan banks after already initial sales of oil by the US. Now, lastly, the linking of oil and security is also dangerous and problematic. January 9th alone, Trump signed an executive order, 14373, which basically protects from legal scrutiny and intervention.
I'm a widow, and my husband.
These sales as, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. So I'll stop for now, and I'm glad to elaborate on these points further and what we can do about these things. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fuentes Bautista.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie and SBS, for the invitation to share my insights about the crisis in the country as a Venezuelan American. I have followed since the very moment that the news came up, social media and so forth, what it was doing. I was invited basically to offer kind of a more domestic view of the situation and talk about how Venezuelans actually are living the current moment. So, but I have to start by saying that any analysis of the Venezuelan current situation will take place really in the context of the complex humanitarian crisis that the country has endured for over a decade. These crises have manifested in hyperinflation, widespread shortages of food and medicine, dramatic rise of poverty. Nowadays, we calculate that 80% of Venezuelans live in poverty, and maybe more than half are living in situation of extreme poverty. Amidst all that, of course, there have been protests and dissent, particularly between 2015, 17. Different waves of protests have been met with, really repression and massive human rights violations that have been very well documented by international organizations, including the UN's Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, according to the International Organization of Migration, we went from having something about like 700,000 Venezuelans living abroad in 2015 to about 7.9 million people actually displaced all around the world by 2025, and that represents about 25% of the population. So, for all these reasons, the electoral fraud of July 28, 2024, through which Maduro sought to remain in power for 6 more years, became for many Venezuelans who have worked hardly through all kinds of processes of negotiations and transition and talks, as well as for analysts, a clear sign that maybe a peaceful democratic change in the country, it was very difficult to achieve. It was basically, what would ensue this the electoral cycle was another wave of repression, more detentions, and so forth. However, I will agree with many of my colleagues in Venezuela, and experts on Venezuela, when they talk about what happened on January 3rd as really not really a solution for the country by itself. We think about really how to solve the problem, and Maduro departure and will not solve that problem, much less if this stabilizing intervention of the U.S. Will be managed from Washington and executed by the same network of tribalist loyalties that have run the country through under Maduro and have left institutions in ruins. So after decades of intense political polarization, a staggering number of people displaced around the world, and a failed and corrupt state, quite frankly, we are facing a country that is in shambles. The collapse of our national sovereignty, I think it was revealed by the U.S. military action of January 3rd, and has laid bare the consequences of this process of national dissolution, one in which the leadership of the country, and here I'm talking about the pro-government and opposition groups alike, are proven unable to sit at the table and negotiate next steps. Instead, they are now forced to engage in strategic exchanges of cooperation and pleasantries with the Trump administration. And we are not a country held together by a social contract anymore, or a shared recent history, at least one that we all Venezuelans can recognize as common. We are a fractured society where a few control all of the resources and the majority really are struggling just for survival. So in this very fragmented scenario, people ask whether Venezuelans actually have supported the U.S. intervention in the country. And the answer for that actually depends on whom you ask. I have some, let me see if I can share here some, if you can see it, looking at some of the, most recent poll on these same questions, we observe couple of trends. There are big divides between public opinion abroad, Venezuelans in the exile or diaspora, and those living in the country. But it has been also clear that since January 3rd, also there is a shift in those results, and there are more people in the country that seems to be in support of what happened through the U.S. intervention. Now, what this means is more, we need more time to unpack, and I'll be happy to talk about this in the Q&A. One of the key issues for me also is still how between those who approve and disapprove, there are many more in the country that don't know really what's going on. And that's per se something that we should maybe acknowledge and talk about more. So going back, let me see. Oops, sorry. Did I finish my sharing? Yes, no?
Yes, you're not
Okay,
sharing
thank
anymore.
you. Okay, thank you. I don't see myself in the main screen, but if you all see me, that's
We
what
see you.
counts. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the other aspect is basically, I will not talk right now. I can comment on that, on the difficult, I would say, negotiations that has happened in the last 10 years or so. But let's say that's the failure of those negotiations actually were some of the things that justify or push, let's say, the Nobel Committee and Norway to assume a more critical stance towards the Maduro regime, and ended up actually acknowledging the leadership of Maria Corina Machado, leading the electoral process of 2024 that ended really with the yes, we can say it, as proven by the acts. And the records they collected with their win over the Maduro's candidacy, correct? So I want to end with some few reflections about the challenges and risks of a possible transition. So many ask what happened now. Are we witnessing a transaction for Venezuela's natural wealth and resources, or a transition to democracy? And if we attend to President Trump's words, this administration is really pursuing the former, not the latter, correct? So U.S. actions have yet to secure a more peaceful transition to democracy in the country. Venezuelans have demonstrated and committed themselves to the democratic path as it was demonstrated in 2024. However, their mobilization has been brutally repressed. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see right now people on the streets of the country, correct? To express support or even to reject what is the intervention of the U.S. So, and there are many aspects that have to be dealt with before we get there. Actually, we are in the process of liberation of political prisoners after the 24 elections. Those dissenters and voices that went to protest the takeover by the government again, were detained. So it was calculated about 2,000 people were detained back then. Right now, I think by the moment that the intervention happened, it were around 1,400s. The latest numbers I've seen, half of them have been freed. However, in the recent weeks, in the last 2 weeks, however, many remain in jail, and there are new reports of previously unknown cases that have emerged as families who fear retaliation have now spoken up by the first time, correct? So besides the liberation of political prisoners, what else do we have to secure for a democratic transition, correct? A peaceful one. Well, so many things. For instance, we need to adopt urgent measures to disarm, withdraw, and dismantle all the structures of security forces and paramilitary groups that operate in the country. We also need to nullify a number of laws and decrees that, among them, the decree of state of external emergency, or conmoción exterior, that was passed actually by Maduro before it was taken hostage or withdrawn from the country. We need to even lift internet blockage that is still operating in the country, restrictions on the free press. There is no access, for instance, for international correspondence even to access the country right now. We need to lift sanctions and restrictions that are that right now are holding back the operation of many NGOs in the country. We have to grant and allow humanitarian groups access to the country. And this is a response that can be coordinated maybe by the UN. Some have talked about that. There is a problem of actually institutional mass state surveillance over the whole civilian population and how that kind of information will be used. And many have also talking about even how the judiciary system needs to be revamped. We have 80% or so of the judges right now operating or working in interim positions. So it's where to start, correct? So I will leave it for now there, and happy to come in and talk more about what is the outlook, right, going forward. I just want to reiterate and highlight the fact that there is so much uncertainty in the country and fear, quite frankly. So that's what maybe explain the lack of mobilization that we have seen the last 2 weeks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I want to encourage people to keep writing into the Q&A, and we will answer questions that we can by text. And then I'm going to sort of take some of those questions and direct them to some of our speakers. The first question I want to turn to you, Martha, and it's really about there's a question about the current leaders. And so we have a question about Jorge Rodriguez and Cabello, and I imagine Delcy Rodriguez, one of the questions that comes up is, if Maduro claims that he is the head of state and then he gets immunity, and the United States says, but we haven't recognized you since 2019, and we think your election in 2024 was stolen. We recognized the opposition candidate, but now we recognize your vice president as the sitting head of state, right? It throws in this interesting complication for the domestic criminal law enforcement operation against Maduro, who wants to claim he has head of state immunity. But it also throws into a question what is going to happen with the current regime in power in Venezuela. And I'm wondering if you or if any of the other panelists know what the story for people living in Venezuela is as to whether they support the current regime, whether there's a belief that with Maduro gone, there will be any changes. The list that you just gave is a transformation of the state that nobody is offering, right? But there is a question online about, well, the people specifically in power right now, what do we think is going to happen with them? And I would just add to that, both in terms of domestic politics, but possibly international as well. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Let me try to answer the different layers of it. From the legal perspective, uh, since Rodriguez as Rodriguez president, many people said that she just had 6 months or 3 months actually first, and then with a possible extension for really remain in power and settle for maybe calling on new elections and whatnot. Will that happen? We don't know, correct? She has not, nobody has talked about this particular issue. In terms of the leadership, it has been said, and actually, I think it's evident in the way how the leadership of the government right now have acted, that they are set in different roles, correct, to manage this moment. So everybody seems to be having a role. For instance, Diosdado Cabello, who handles everything that has to do with security forces and whatnot in the country, has been more about securing people, that nothing is happening, that everything is peace and order, that everything is under control. Although he did deliver a very somber address to the nation to talk about the more than 100 people that lost their lives during the attack, correct? And by the way, everybody has been surprised that there have been no more information or news stories or anything about these that die in the attack. We got the information about the 32 guards that Cuban guards that were part of the security detail of Maduro that died during the attack, but we have not even know more about the Venezuelans, correct? So they have kept information very controlled, very secret. Desi Rodriguez, you will see it soon here in Washington. She has been performing like, okay, I'm managing this. Is the new kind of executive leader, calling for a transition that could be about cooperation with the U.S. and whatnot. So they are keeping their profiles in check, and they are kind of divided up their roles, and definitely less contentious and so forth, correct? So people have the say who is in charge. In the meantime, the truth is that you go out in Caracas, in the streets of the country, around the country, and you can be still stopped, and paramilitary forces ask you for your cell phones and look at your social media, and yes, you can be detained. Correct? I mean, like at the same time, people are just having some hopes around the liberation of political prisoners. That's what it has been, being followed up more. But as I said, there is much more that needs to be happening right now in that regard. That also people are clueless. There is also that shutdown of. We don't have a press that it could be trustworthy. So actually, people like myself outside receive information and we start to circulate them. Sometimes people hear from us first, then from national sources. So that's a little bit of the situation right now. A lot of uncertainty and little accountability, little transparency, or none whatsoever. So one of the things that is happening actually is that some organizations that are, like for instance, I just saw today a group of NGOs that work on human rights issues setting an agenda. to talk about, hey, here are the points that we need for a transition, correct? We need more of that internally and externally. Quite frankly, this is the moment that we need regional actors, international actors to accompany this push from the civil society to reclaim some control and sovereignty in their decisions.
Thanks. Another question that came up that I think I can direct towards Professor Carpenter, I can also talk about as well, is whether we see this as precedent or what types of precedents we see that are similar in terms of crossing into another country against their consent to engage in either a police operation or some other type of invasion, and whether we think that this is going to empower other leaders who might want to do the same thing.
How's the volume?
Better.
Better. Okay. I apologize that I was garbled before. Yeah, I'm glad you punted this question from Justin to me, Jamie. I had mentioned in my remarks, I don't know if you could hear me, that you could imagine a way in which this could have been an operation with quite a lot of legitimacy. And one of the reasons that could be the case is that there is precedent for going in and removing a leader at a relatively low cost to human life that is persecuting his population, where there are gross human rights violations present, crimes against humanity. The Maduro regime is known for that scale of human rights repression. The International Criminal Court has an investigation open. There's been documented killings, arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, etc. In the past, the UN Security Council has been willing to treat situations like that as a threat to international peace and security when a great power made the case and was willing to put boots on the ground. This happened in Libya, this happened in Bosnia. And another argument that has held sway at the Security Council in the past has been refugee flows. So the Trump administration is reasonably concerned with the instability of Latin American regimes contributing to immigration north. States have often pointed to a destabilizing influx of refugees as an argument that domestic human rights conditions in one country create threats to international peace and security. So you could imagine a world in which the US convinced the Security Council to protect Venezuelan civilians by removing Maduro. And even if Russia or China vetoed, if the US had a multilateral coalition with some legitimacy for this approach, that would give the raid at least a veneer of legitimacy, even if it wasn't technically legal. This is what happened in Kosovo, for example, in 1999. And you could even get around the doctrine of sovereign immunity. You could imagine a world in which the US had simply waited for the International Criminal Court to issue an arrest warrant for Maduro, which may already be forthcoming, but is certainly something they're looking at. Because then he could be lawfully arrested. That would not, sovereign immunity would not cover crimes against humanity. Then, of course, he would need to be turned over to The Hague and not tried in court on drug charges, but rather tried for what he did to his own people. And those were just choices that weren't made. And of course, they would have required, especially putting together a coalition of the willing, that would have required diplomacy and some consensus building and not alienating all our European allies. And it would have required some moral high ground on the part of the US, a willingness to actually comply with international law as regards our own citizenry as well. You're muted.
The main thing I would say in international law that keeps coming up when we look at cases like this is self-defense. So when we went into Panama, the government of Panama had actually declared war against the United States. And we sent in 20,000 troops. It took days to get Noriega. It's actually a very different situation. We also, in that case, claimed that there was something related to human rights with our goal to take out, they called him the de facto head of state. He was the head of the armed forces, and they had basically nullified an election. And so it's really an interesting but different precedent that I think is really instructive for thinking about what's going on with Venezuela. There is very little in international law that you could argue is self-defense here. The claim is that it's related to drug trafficking, that international drug trafficking, we have a right to use the military to defend ourselves from. I don't think there's a precedent for that in international law. We did go into Pakistan and kill Osama bin Laden without their consent. And the claim there was Pakistan would have consented if we had felt like we had the security to inform Pakistan. And then domestically, it was also a really different situation because Obama was relying on the congressional authorization, which is the authorized use of military force in relation to 9/11. And so there was actually a law passed by Congress that gave the executive the authority to do this. Again, in the case of Venezuela and taking out Maduro, the Congress wasn't notified, and it's a very strange self-defense claim. Whether or not we think this is going to inspire other leaders, it's an open question. I keep hearing people say those leaders are going to go in and do what they want, whether the U.S. does or not. I do think that when we look at what's happening with Greenland and just in general, how the administration is directly flouting international law. I mean, the way that I've looked at this, and Professor Carpenter and maybe Bernal and Fuentes Bautista can add. There was lip service to international law when we have violated the territorial integrity of other countries. We claimed that there was something related to self-defense. In this instance, there was a statement that we don't follow international law. And so I think that makes this a really different situation.
Can I just follow up on that? Another way in which the Osama bin Laden raid is different is that Al-Qaeda did attack the US and 4,000 people died. And the UN General Assembly and Security Council recognized that the US had the right to defend itself against this terror network. So there was a situation of armed conflict between us and Al-Qaeda. It was treated that way, and that is very different. But the fact is, yes, great powers states violate international law all the time, and powerful states can get away with it more than most. I think that there's a faulty perception, however, and that's very much a part of the narrative right now, that this means international law is dead or dying somehow. And I think that's categorically untrue. Acts like this, whether we're talking about a cross-border raid that violates the UN Charter, or threats to take Greenland, which would violate the UN Charter, or just shooting survivors of boat strikes, which violates the Geneva Conventions and human rights law. These are worrying instances of international law violation, but they do not mean the rules-based order is falling apart. What matters is how others react. Do third parties come in and affirm and defend those rules? And that is what we are seeing at the Security Council, at the General Assembly, at the Council of Europe, and in the streets of Minneapolis today. The fact that the Trump administration does not admit this was an armed attack in a weird way also signals that they also remain invested in the UN Charter rules. They want to claim that this was somehow not an armed attack because they know that if it were, it would not have been legal under the UN Charter. And those rules protect the US as well.
We have a couple of questions that we don't have a lot of time, so I just wanted to ask, people are very curious about the role of oil in this conflict and what it means for people in Venezuela and the region, and also whether people who are in the US or elsewhere, 8 million people have left Venezuela as the GDP dropped 80% and the country collapsed. Do they want to go home? What is the word on the street from people who have left, and what might their legal options be if their temporary protected status continues to not exist in the U.S.? Angelica or Martha, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to briefly talk about oil. I put some references because OPEC and others still consider Venezuela a hugely oil reserve rich country. And the important thing to keep in mind is that, yes, in some ways we've seen the emergence of alternative and energy sources and increase in other kind of industries that are not oil, like lithium and other kinds of mining. However, oil has been and still remains really important in the region, and it has been for a long time. The fact that Venezuela had oil greatly impacted the amount of power that the Chavez administration had. Even prior to that, it also was a huge, the huge role that the U.S. And the kind of relationship they had with Venezuela was related to oil. And yes, it's an industry that it is very expensive to invest in. However, I wouldn't characterize it as a declining industry just from the latest set of oil auctions. So the way that oil is sold is sold through literally like auctions of territory and to the highest bidder on a global market. And from the latest I've seen in the book that I'm working on, it's like a very vibrant marketplace. And not only a marketplace in terms of the sale of oils, but how much is invested in oil, including things like pensions. A lot of pension plans, a lot of US investments are held by oil companies. And this is not just oil companies, but banks that support the investments in this, like hedge funds, like Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, a lot of banks, BlackRock investments that hold these investments in oil. So that just is a signal of what the import given to oil, given that so many of investment portfolios rely on oil investments. So not at all a declining industry. So it will remain to be something that is seen, because you're seeing that there is reluctance by oil industry because of what Chavez had done before to their interests. So are they willing to invest? And I'd love to hear from Marta your perspective of what are the negotiations going on right now to supposedly give assurance to the company that they're not going to be facing expropriation, that they're going to have basically what the contracts that they're going to be looking at that should be favorable to their interests, which to me means that they won't be favorable to regular folks in Venezuela getting any benefit from whatever may come from sale of oils at all.
No, and I think that that's why Delcy Rodriguez is coming to Washington, correct? Part of her role right now is to give these assurances to
Exactly.
American investors. So yes, we are all waiting to hear what is the new law of the land according to them. But I just want to refer before we go to the second part of Jamie's question. I don't have right now, like in front of me, hard numbers, but the situation of the Venezuelan diaspora is very complex, and here in the U.S. we have people really in a legally, in a legal void, and so I know of people who have left. I have that self-deported, actually, even to Venezuela. I have known people that cannot go any place, and others that are just getting by, correct, with in by the way, different geographies of this country. It does matter and makes a difference in how you feel the pressure of, for instance, ice rates, correct? Like, and so something that I also saw happening, I would say, since last year up until now, is that the pressure is real. It's true that Venezuelans, those who could vote, for instance, in Florida, were supporters of Trump. But even Venezuelans right now are saying, like, hey, we didn't sign up for this, correct? Or they are going too far. But the other part that is very concerning is how the situation in Venezuela and of Venezuelans in the US have been weaponized on social media to feed into polarizing discourses continued feeding into polarizing discourses, correct, in this country, and justify violence and unprecedented police violence against immigrants overall around the country. So in all these areas, I have found people say, yeah, I mean, I would like to go back, but or see how, this can unfold for the country, but everybody is just waiting out, quite frankly. And given the uncertainties that, that we don't have anything clear at this point on what is going or will happen in the next even 3-6 months.
Well, I want to thank everyone and thank the dean and thank SBS for helping us organize this. To everyone listening, we at UMass are continuing to try to hold events that we want to strongly encourage you to come to on campus or online. This is our charge, is to support public knowledge And so please be on the lookout for more events like this. Dean Rathmeyer?
Thanks again for a really informative discussion. I want to thank our 4 panelists who are just a small sampling of the incredible knowledge that we have across the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And we look forward to having more really informative discussions as the term continues. Have a great evening.